Thank you guys for having me. It's great to see all these faces back here. And thank you all for coming out to SSF. It's really an honor to have you all. Proximal junctional failure is one of kind of the banes of our existence as spine surgeons. And I think, unfortunately, if you are planning to be a spine surgeon, whether you're even doing smaller degenerative cases, I think some of our techniques earlier on in a patient's surgical career can really contribute to having worse outcomes later down the road. And then if you are going to be willing to tackle deformity, this is just something to, I think there's no kind of easy answers here, but I do think that it's a very important thing to bring up. So just kind of run through some of the things we're going to look at here, obviously being mindful of time. Proximal junctional kyphosis, you'll hear the phrase PJK. That can be just the kyphosis, or some people say PJF. So when I say failure there, this patient on the right hand, slide, has proximal junctional kyphosis, a 10-degree change. When we look at our patients, if you're going to be doing deformity surgery, the rate of proximal junctional kyphosis, as defined by these measures, is probably 100%. Most of these patients are doing okay. When you're going from a very rigid construct to normal bone above, having kyphosis is part of the problem. All right, it's just going to be part of their kind of natural history as we age. And then I would also, some of this can be extrapolated to distal junctional when we're talking about cervical, long cervical fusions and having distal junctional problems. Less of the focus of this talk, but again, that's kind of the same ideas that are going to be contributing. And at a certain point, this patient may become symptomatic and require an extension of their fusion. One day versus the next, how does that turn into a proximal junctional failure? Either it's the patient's symptoms, but there can be, pretty significant neurologic problems, severe alignment issues as well. And so these are all things to keep in mind. So when we talk about PJK or PJF, there's significant risk factors, and unfortunately, not all of these are, things that we can control. One of the things, I think one of the challenges looking at this, there is just so much literature out there. A lot of it is really focused on, sort of these numbers. So when we look at appropriate alignment, definitely if you are undercorrecting your patient, we look at the kind of, golden rule of the PILL. We can talk for an hour just about, ways to look at alignment. But if you're not realigning your patient appropriately, I think that's a big thing. Bone density is a modifiable risk factor. Sarcopenia or muscle mass, kind of go through these things. But, bone density is something that, again, in the ideal world, you absolutely should be looking at this. DEXA remains the gold standard, but, I think that is really something that I think can be misleading. I have plenty of patients where if you look at their Hounsfield units, we're looking at the lumbar spine here. This is how, if you really want to accurately look at it, it's taking multiple axial sections through the spine. We expect these numbers to be above 110 at the L1 level. If you're looking at the thoracic or cervical spine, those numbers should be higher, depending on the study you look at. But even though they may have gotten a DEXA scan, they've got a little osteopenia. They probably looked at the spine. If there are osteophytes, that's going to artificially elevate that number. And so looking at this can give you another tool to say, even if they've been cleared by, their endocrinologist because their DEXA scan is only osteopenia or maybe normal, this can give you another tool to say, hey, maybe I do want to be more aggressive in treating their osteopenia. When we look at sarcopenia, some people think that this is a risk factor for PJK and PJF. Looking, and there's multiple many studies that looked at ways to really assess how robust a patient is. And I think it's not just at the levels of the fusion, but this is an indicator of how well their paraspinal muscles work above the fusion. There's going to be a lot more stress on those areas. And so, the studies that have looked at this as a predictor for PJK, I don't think are all that great. But again, I think there's so many things that come together. We'll talk a little bit more about how do you make that decision on whether to do a big deformity surgery on patients. And I think this is something that you do want to have a look at. It's a very, this is a CT scan. You can also see it on MRI. It gives you a good idea of, does this patient need more optimization, or are they going to be appropriate to go ahead with surgery right away? Again, we've all looked at these numbers for, PILL mismatch. Where is that? We can talk about making sure that we have the appropriate alignment for the kind of type of spine, whether it's a low PI, high PI, where is that lordosis if they've had previous fusions. These are all kind of deeper nuances of spinal deformity. But basically, if you are overcorrecting or undercorrecting a patient, especially an elderly patient, and you're getting too much correction, that's going to be kind of a setup for failure at the proximal aspect of your construct. We would all like these numbers to be perfect. Some people would say age matched, you can get a little bit less lordosis relative to the PI in your older patients. I still think that has to be very close. Maybe being slightly less aggressive in an older patient is okay, but I do think that you really should strive to get these patients well aligned within 5 or 10 degrees of their PI. So we talk about undercorrection here, as being a risk factor that needed to be extended up. Overcorrection as well. And, you can see with this pretty aggressive PSO, the expectation that spine is going to hold up with that aggressive of a correction is just something that, we as surgeons can control. So it should be a very strong focus of your preoperative planning. Preventative tools, I think these are all valuable. If you have a patient that has already failed and you're extending them up, do you want to bring some of these into the surgery? Kypho and vertebroplasty. I know we use these. We'll talk more about that. Proximal tethers and hooks, trying to create a soft landing at the proximal junction. And then, I know Rod can maybe comment on this, but people that are doing longer MIS deformity surgeries where you're really not disrupting the proximal envelope, do feel that that's something that can minimize the risk of PJF. And then things that have come up, variable diameter rods. I think that's something that's coming in the future, but trying to make a less rigid construct at the proximal aspect. So, a couple studies have looked at the vertebroplasty, some of them with good results, others show that it doesn't make a difference. Again, this is one piece in probably 10 moving parts that are all going to contribute. So I will use this in cases where, their patient has had a failure. This was a tumor case. For anyone that's had this happen, this patient fortunately was neurologically intact. We did not see this in the case, but if as soon as you have cement extravasation into the canal, you will be a lot less likely to want to use this technique. I think it can be done. You just have to be very careful to minimize the breach and be very careful with your pedicle screw placement. This screw had a very small medial breach, and the cement will take the path of least resistance. And this is a very nerve-wracking scan to have to look at. Talking about soft landing, these are one of the studies that looked at techniques. This is a biomechanical study. So we're looking here. These are TP hooks. These are bands that this is a technique that Dr. Hart, one of my former teachers and partners, was very really liked, and The study from the ISSG shows that one, the alignment is huge. Two, if you have the opportunity, I think that these are helpful. It's not going to be that, putting these into your construct is not going to fix a bad alignment, but I think it can give you a little bit of extra support to create some rigidity. And again, these are kind of bands that are tensioned. These are kind of done by hand. We're looking at cement. They're all things that, in the lab are shown to make a slight transition from the highly rigid construct to the normal spine and those UIV +1 and +2. I do think if you're doing deformity surgery, you do want to use these. Problem with tethers and hooks, obviously there are patients that are not great surgical candidates that may have a neurologic deficit and they're going to fail. If you look here on the left, those hooks are now very prominent in the skin. And these are, things that you have to keep in mind and be ready for if you are going to use these techniques. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Mumanemni over UCSF, a really good study here comparing PERC versus open posterior screw placement. And this was an interesting case because they were doing, either lateral and A-lift. So they were doing a lot of anterior column reconstruction for most of their deformity correction and then just doing the screws percutaneous. And, although they did see similar outcome measures in terms of their scores. They did find that there was a higher revision rate for PJK in the open group. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, but I do think that this is evidence that this is basically a biologic proximal banding technique by just keeping all that musculature and the ligaments intact. And so just want to finish with a case. This is a patient that came into my clinic, and she's 66. Her DEXA scan is probably, just barely osteoporotic, but qualifies as being osteoporotic in the hip. And this lady is miserable. Her posture looks pretty bad here, but she has tremendous back pain. Really not a lot of stenosis per se, but this deformity is really affecting her life, and she's coming into your office regularly. She's done everything you asked for. She's miserable, and I feel like this is a very high risk, but what do you do with these patients? Do you tell them, I'm sorry, we're not going to do surgery? Or do you just operate on them knowing that their risk of proximal junctional failure is exceedingly high? So just like to hear from the group, kind of what are some of the things that you do with these patients that you can look at them. This lady definitely has sarcopenia. She is, going for osteoporosis management. How long do you treat them? And all of these things I think are things that we should do as surgeons to really minimize that risk. But at the end of the day, it's something that can be unavoidable. So Koja, what do you do in terms of optimization?
I do have a nice collaboration with our both our prehab unit and also endocrine, where I would want her to rapidly get the top of the line disease modifying agent and also follow her through the course. I typically would prefer at least 6 months of treatment.
6 months?
Yes. I think the minimum is 3 months, or recommendation is 3 months, but I prefer at least 6 months. And a strong discussion of adjacent disease and also just her actual musculoskeletal fitness for the surgery. I've moved away from the rather skew and quick T2 to pelvis with X-lifts and osteotomies, and actually do proper patient counseling and treatment.
Any thoughts, Charlie?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Hamilton. I think Forteo for a patient like this is a key aspect to helping secure their future. Because Forteo not only increases bone density but also enhances bone fusion. It's good to sort of time it properly so that they get the benefit of the Forteo after the fusion as well as before. So I think that's one of the key elements is to time it properly.
So we have a checklist. I would add, so Jens has got me on the recumbent bicycle, Forteo. We can give patients Wegovy, pre-op. You got to have all those before. Weight management, I think, is a big thing as well. What about proximal, kind of addressing that proximal junction? Do you do a preemptive, whether it's cement or tether or?
I typically cement the top level using fenestrated screws. I don't have much experience with tethering, but I'm interested in learning more about it.
So what I do is, if I'm getting help with exposure, I always want them to expose 2 levels less than what we agreed upon, and so to avoid any disruption of the muscle above that without me being physically present and scrubbed in. Number one. Number two, part of my preoperative assessment is to look at the size of the pedicles and also the adjacent pedicle size and the careful analysis of the disc space and CT evaluation of the Hounsfield units of the UIV plus 2 and the UIV to see, am I stopping at a very tenuous place before I proceed.
All very valuable points. Well, yeah, I think that's my last slide. So thank you guys. Any questions from the group? Don't be afraid of deformity surgery. For these, we do see patients do poorly in some of these cases, but these are also some of your most grateful patients that will really make your practice very valuable. So, it's something that I really enjoy doing. So thank you all for having me, and I think we're headed to the lab soon here, huh?
No.
One more? Okay, sorry.